this reading group just started 3 days ago. That report was the sort of launch of this whole 3 days. Reading, informing themselves, feeling the need to educate themselves about financial history, and reading all kinds of books, some of them written by me, which is always lovely to hear that people actually read your books. You never know. You write them, they go into the library. So here I made a little point. I mentioned Kuhn's Arena of International Finance as something that I thought you might want to. So this is moving towards suggesting things for the future for the reading group. Maybe you remember that Tom Ferguson mentioned DeCecco's Money and Empire as something that you might want to be reading if you haven't already. And Dan mentioned Hicks' Market Theory of Money. So if you haven't read these things, you should read these things, put them on your list. So what is this conversation, this increasingly common language? And why do people want it? Well, we call it the money view, and we want it because it seems to be good for thinking, good for figuring things out. This forensic method that I think Sweeney referred to Zoltan as using the money view for forensic purposes to try to figure stuff out. I thought that was a nice phrase. I was quite taken by the fact that some people have referenced, maybe it was Alex, gone back to the origins of my own attempt to find this language that started in my study of the American institutionalists and their conversation about money in my first book, Money, Interest, and the Public Interest. And Vision of Minsky, which Anastasia mentioned as an inspiration for her PhD thesis, should really be viewed as a fourth subject. I did 3 in the first book, and then when they asked, when Chaim Minsky died, the journal asked me if maybe I would like to write a little biographical thing about him, and I took them very seriously. When people suggest that you write something that then they're going to publish, and you don't have to really worry that there's going to be all kinds of fighting and editing of things. Generally, it's a good idea to say yes, but then take it seriously and try to make it as good as you can. That's what led me to Stigum. That I noticed that how he had learned about society was by being a banker, and I had to figure out a way to kind of pretend I was a banker by reading the Bible of the money market traders. Stigum. So these are, everyone knows these things. I'm just listing them here for posterity. The things in this conversation, in this language that we share, this balance sheet method, you could see it everywhere in the last 3 days, using it to map financial society, who owes who what, and so forth, stocks and flows, moving and being able to move back and forth between those levels, moving up and down in the hierarchy also with the same method, so that you don't have macroeconomics and microeconomics, you just have balance sheets. I've always said the 2 main analytical ideas here that really have solid power are the survival constraint, settlement constraint, reserve constraint, and the dealer model, the trainer model. I was really so tickled to see how much the trainer model is now being used. I've always said that the main 4 difficulties in understanding money are these 4 things: alchemy, hierarchy, hybridity, instability. And I will say that it repeatedly people are reminding themselves of this and looking into those concepts. And it is in fact what holds the community together, that they're alert to, don't let me get tripped up by ignoring those things. The last one, I think, is the constancy of institutional change, that looking around you and trying to understand the dynamics of the system, that this is, shift from elasticity to discipline, and in specific from financial innovation to regulation, and is a particular case of that. So institutional change is part of the dynamics of the system. It's not a static thing. What did we talk about with that language? Now I'm reviewing the last 3 days. There were what I would call some old frontiers. We were sort of reviewing the troops in the offshore dollar system, in the core and in the periphery. What's going on with the global dollar funding system, the FX swap system, money market mutual funds. Inyaki's talk was important there, but also what's happening in the global South, the global dollar funding, integration of the global South, particularly this morning. Those talks this morning are very, very compelling, and understanding how Se-Young was saying about the way that Korea kind of entered into the Eurodollar system. Really, I think there's a lot more work to be done there. We talked about the maturation of the Fed's backstop of this system, the integration of the SDR as a sort of lower level, but nonetheless possibly important piece of that backstop. We talked about the way that periodic financial crisis produces institutional change at various places in the system. Another theme that is I call old frontiers, is the prevalence of market making, the bank dealer complex that we need to bring up to consciousness. Mostly we have talked about financial futures of various kinds, but in some of these conversations, we talked about broadening that out and thinking about commodity dealers and commodity futures. And I was particularly tickled that this language of the trainer model is now being used for intellectual discourse, that we are categorizing ourselves as outside spread thinkers or inside spread thinkers, and appreciating that an actual market requires both. Okay, so that there's a division of labor here, that in order for liquid thinking, you need both kinds of thinkers. But what was particularly compelling to me, and what kept me going, seeing every single session, was looking for also some new frontiers. And so there were some. So the session on China, for example, Saturday morning, I knew some things about China. I had actually written some things about China and why the RMB is not a danger to the dollar a long time ago, but I haven't really been paying attention that closely. And so here we go. These were really fascinating, and a new generation of students, generating actual knowledge inside the classroom. I wish I had students like that. Fine. They are my students, I suppose, indirectly. So I will view them as such. Political economy also is much more, I feel, on a new frontier that we're actually engaging with. That we found ways to use the money view to talk about that, as opposed to, okay, now let's bring the politics in, as if it's a separate sphere. That in fact the money view is political already. Hierarchy is part of that. The settlement constraint, whose constraints bind and whose don't. We had the talk by Menand on the origins of the Fed, or I would view it more broadly as this is about negotiating hybridity. Where exactly is the boundary between public and private? And some of that was that conversation about CBDC that we just had now was similarly about that. We had two sessions on crypto. I don't think we've ever done that before. And we learned a practitioner's view of the two different hierarchies, the fiat stablecoin hierarchy and the Bitcoin hierarchy, and the little petri dish that is DeFi. And then we continued the conversation with CBDC. These are new frontiers, which to me, as a historian of thought, as an intellectual historian, this shows that this money view language is a progressive research program, because it keeps finding new places where you can use it, and then each thing is sort of added on. Okay, it's not separate. Okay, and all the people who could talk about the previous ones can talk about this one and appreciate because it's the same language. So here I will say current issues. Is this my last slide? Maybe it is. The big picture. So this is meant to segue to conversation about where we are right now. So global macro, from Sweeney, yesterday, we kind of converged on this idea that we're moving into a disciplinary phase in the system as a whole. That might mean overnight interest rates rising, maybe not as much as they should for various political economy reasons. That means shifting to discipline mode. That means there's going to be binding survival constraints, and we will find who's swimming naked, as Warren Buffett, I think, always said. this is not, this is a regular thing in the system, the global financial cycle. And we've generally seen the worry before COVID was that the place where this was going to bind was in the emerging markets. And so we will see. But it may also, Dan keeps saying, hopefully, that a lot of crypto is going to go away and people are going to lose their shirts. So maybe that's another vulnerability that we're going to see. We can watch for that. That's the state of current global macro. But even broadly, we're exiting COVID. What is maybe, hopefully, exiting COVID? What's next? So we talked about climate finance and maybe, and we were supposed to have a paper on financing the Green New Deal. So maybe that's for next year or for later. And the political economy that's left over from the incredible increase in inequality that has happened because of the asset run up after in the stimulus of COVID response. I think in the background of all these conversations, there's a feeling that the U.S. political leadership of the globe, okay, is sort of in decline, but the dollar system was never stronger, okay, and that's an interesting conundrum. And the increase in inequality that has been so exacerbated is really undermining political equilibrium in every nation that you can see, pretty much, and perhaps globally as well. So we seem to be in for a period of economic volatility. Okay, and what I would like to view that as in a positive way, as an opportunity for intellectual flux. Those are, as I say, times of crises are times of institutional change, and we are all there is. Here's what I'm reading now. So these are things that you might want to, if you want to talk about them. I haven't read them yet, but that's another thing to put on your reading list for your reading group if you want. These are the 6 books that I'm reading in my global money class after the midterm, and recent books. So that's another possible group of things that I've chosen. So I want to integrate them into, and when I read them, I always say, what's the money view of these things? So these are more information from another little corner of the system. And I learned from that. You might have noticed that James Sweeney's a reader. Okay, everyone was a reader. That seems to be a common thread in this group as well.
Great, thank you, Perry.